Certain epochs and events in world history seem like distant history to us. You know, they happened sometime else, they were incomprehensible, dense. As the expression goes, they are consigned to history books. But when you view those events through the personal lens of an individual narrator, you realize what an exciting and sometimes quite dark and in other times quite comedic episodes these must be. Such is the case with Ali Efendi and the Basiretçi newspaper during the final decades of the Ottoman Empire. This is summarized by yours truly from the incredible memoir İstanbul'da Yarım Asırlık Vekayi-i Mühimme, Important Events of a Half Century in Istanbul by Basiretçi Ali Efendi, the publisher of the Basiretçi newspaper, and it's a Turkish language memoir which I read and summarized and condensed and turned into an incredible adventure story retelling just for you YouTubers. So before beginning, I want two things from you. One is to please consider supporting me on Patreon, on Buy Me a Coffee, and get me some of my merch. It really helps to get this channel going. You always get something back. On Patreon, there's a world of surreal art that nobody else gets to see. And even on Buy Me a Coffee, look, imagine we're sitting together, we're in a nice cafe, next table there's some nice girls and everything, and I'm like, But have you heard of the story of Ali Efendi and the Basiretçi newspaper? Now, after such an experience, you might feel the need to buy Daddy Kozman his cup of coffee. And if you want to do that, Buy Me a Coffee is the platform to go to. And if you do that, you also get to see a gallery of colorful pictures that nobody else gets to see anywhere else. Please put your money where your hearts are. It really means a lot to me. For even as little as $1 a month, I can't be more thankful. So that was the first thing I wanted to tell you before getting the go-ahead with this story. My second point is you might not be from Turkey and you may not have a specific interest in the Ottoman Empire, and that's perfectly fine. Try to listen to this story and appreciate this story in terms of a human drama, because we're going to be seeing a lot of political intrigues, some dark humor, a lot of censorship, and a lot of weird life details which anyone in any country can relate to these days, especially if they are close to, let us say, sources of power, if they are involved with decision making in any capacity. I promise you, this is a story you will not get to hear anywhere else. So now let us go. We are going to do this chapter by chapter by the reigns of different sultans in the last part of the Ottoman Empire. So here we go. Behold the reign of Sultan Abdulaziz Han el-Muzaffer Daima. Welcome to the 1870s, and we are in the capital of the Ottoman Empire, Istanbul, also known as Constantinople, Der Saadet, and by many other names. It's a bustling city, barely holding together a multi-ethnic, multinational empire of increasingly conflicting interests and encroaching foreign influence and domination. It is an empire about to fall apart, and the question on everybody's mind is how do we hold things together for a little longer? Sound familiar? Well, in this city there are more than 40 newspapers, but only 17 of these are published in the Turkish language, and one of these newspapers, one of the most popular in fact, is the Basiretçi newspaper published by Ali Efendi. And the first part of Ali Efendi's memoirs is the nice part, so I'm going to skip over a lot of details there. Basically, he puts together a crew, gets a permit to publish his newspaper, and actually even getting the permit to publish is a little problematic. He first knocks on the door of the Interior Ministry and he says, I want to make a newspaper, but then the Interior Minister himself comes up to him and says, things are a little hectic right now. There are Greeks in Crete wanting independence and they want to publish newspapers on their own. Now we're refusing them. So if we refuse them and allow you, it's gonna create some problems, So why don't you come back in like 2 goddamn years? And Ali Efendi comes back in 2 years. And finally, the Basiretçi newspaper is in action. Right from the get-go, they encounter a lot of problems. They have actually some bickering, infighting, kind of comical in hindsight. And it reminds me of certain YouTubers or other social media personalities dissing each other. A popular author joins the Basiretçi newspaper but then leaves, and Ali Efendi writes a scathing diss of this person, saying like, he's better off translating French articles for Armenian journalists. He had nothing to give anyways. So anyways, it's like any media outlet you can imagine. But then in Europe, the Franco-Prussian War erupts, and Ali Efendi adopts a pro-German stance, which is quite rare in those days because France was the leading world power with influence over the Ottomans up until that day. To everybody's surprise, the German side wins the Franco-Prussian War, and one night actually, Ali Efendi gets a visitor saying, somebody from the German embassy wants to see you. So he actually gets an invitation to visit Berlin and directly talk to the German emperor, because apparently the German government was reading the Basiretçi newspaper, and off he goes on a nice trip. He gets a lot of help, a lot of funding from the Germans. He gets new publication machines, new printing presses, free of charge, which is a big thing in those days, because remember, back in those days, newspapers were printed semi-manually. You would write an article, then somebody else would set it in print, literally letter by letter, and then off this would go to the printing press, and actual paper copies would be churned out and disseminated. So for picking the winning side, Ali Efendi gets a nice international leg up. Of course, in his own biography, he never tells anything about whether this assistance implied certain responsibilities or maybe certain favors later. Certainly that is how international powers won traction in Turkish politics back in those days, but nothing of the sort is mentioned. When reading this memoir, as in reading any memoir, you have to kind of read between the lines and think about the unspoken things as well as the spoken ones. And things carry on for a while until the appointment of a certain corrupt and idiotic Mahmud Nadim Pasha as the Grand Vizier. Now, for this you have to understand how the Ottoman government operated at the time, which was surprisingly modern and on par with how many European powers operated. There was a royal house in the form of the Sultan and the palace, but surrounding it was a very modern and quite entrenched bureaucracy headed by the Grand Vizier. In analogous terms, this was comparable to the Prime Minister. So whenever I talk about Grand Viziers here, always think about Prime Ministers and not some sort of 1001 Nights or Aladdin sort of character. So this Mahmud Nadim Pasha was a very inept prime minister. He invented certain supplicant customs near the Sultan aimed at winning his favor. So he would bow down 3 times when meeting the Sultan and never do eye contact. And for this, a lot of people in the public were disgusted with him actually. He kept shuffling competent governors around the empire. So when somebody was doing their job too well, Nadim Pasha was threatened by this person and would appoint them to rule in far-off provinces, greatly diminishing the empire's overall effectivity and contributing greatly to his decline. In fact, in his time, people used to say that Nadim Pasha was one of the prime reasons why 600 years, 6 centuries of Ottoman Empire rule across 3 continents began to waver and collapse. And this Nadim Pasha was also extremely corrupt. I'm talking about Pelosi levels of corruption here. He would go and appoint this unknown Greek trader as the sole collector of tobacco revenue from the entire empire, and then he would negotiate a really bad contract for railroads with the German government, then would say, okay, I'm gonna actually negotiate a better contract, and in the first negotiation he would give certain rights for operating railroads to the German Empire, and then he would go back and add insult to injury. So in the second round, he would also lease 8 miles of land around every railroad to the German Empire for their free use. Can you imagine this? Like, how treasonous. And in the story, you're gonna see a lot of people die and get hanged as things get worse for the Ottoman Empire, but none of the true traitors, people who do stuff like this, you get to meet their end, and that's just sad. And I just would like to go on record saying, if you do anything like this, if you lease part of your country's sovereign property, land, wealth, anything, to a foreign entity that irresponsibly, well, you don't deserve to be alive. What a goddamn traitor. And this goes for any country in any age, not just the Ottoman Empire. Anyways, and like many other similar people with similar characters, this Nadim Pasha is also afraid of press and press freedom because he's afraid of challenges to his power. Remember, that's why he was shuffling all these competent and well-liked governors around, desolating the empire. And as the saying goes, sufficiently advanced stupidity is really indistinguishable from pure evil. But back to Nadim Pasha's fear of the press. I mean, the Ottoman Empire wasn't really exactly a haven of freedom of speech to begin with, but this guy made it doubly hard and in fact a little funny and ridiculous to be a newspaper publisher in that time and age. And that's where Ali Efendi's memoirs with publishing the Basiretçi newspaper really begin to shine. I mean, time and again the Grand Vizier Mahmud Nadim Pasha sends his newspaper, his henchman, and tries to convince him to at least write a little favorable about his government, but he has none of it. He actually says, I'll shut up about slandering him, but you can't make me praise him. So time and again, Nadim Pasha says, okay, that's it, I'm shutting down the newspaper, and sends out his headman to go shut the Basiret newspaper down. But as the henchman is halfway with his orders, he has a change of heart. He says, nah, if I shut them down, they might become martyrs or people might rally to their cause. He's that cowardly. So he actually sends a second messenger to call back his henchman, and he tells him, no, don't shut them down, just warn them. So there's a funny anecdote in the story where the same guy comes over and over again warning the newspaper, and in one episode he just says, I've had it enough with your newspaper. Each time you write something critical of the government, Nadim Pasha sends me twice. I walk back in the summer heat. I first go out with orders to shut you guys down for good, but halfway through I get called back, and he says, no, just warn them or exact a money fine. And it's kind of ridiculous like that. When Ali Efendi still does not relent, Grand Vizier Mahmud Nadim summons him directly to his palace and confronts him, saying, why did you write this story about our government? And then actually turns out that story is not even a new story, but it's a translated story from a French language newspaper already cleared for press in the Ottoman Empire. That is to say, it's a French language newspaper still operating in the same country, still bound to the same rules. When he points that out to Mahmud Nadim Pasha, Mahmud Nadim is furious. He says, well, they can write about it, they can critique us in foreign languages, but you can't critique us in Turkish. It's very telling, huh? Such a bully attitude. Anyways, there are a few more episodes like this, and always Ali Efendi is defiant, and at the end, Nadim Pasha has him jailed for 8 days in a special jail, and there's a remarkably cruel form of torture there. This episode takes place during the summer, so it's already very hot, and the jailers still have a stove going, and it makes it excruciatingly hot, like torture. And ostensibly they say, the dungeons are too draughty, you can't catch a cold even in the summer months, so we just want the best for you, and it's an ordeal. But anyways, then Ali Efendi survives this questioning and he's acquitted. Sometimes his newspaper is closed down for a few days, but on the overall it keeps on going. But in the meantime, Mahmud Nadim Pasha's government is really becoming a terrible government. Like, not only is the empire suffering, the common people are beginning to feel the squeeze. There are rebellions fomenting all over the empire. So enter a certain Mithat Pasha, who was a progressive governor of a certain province, and like any person who did their job well under Mahmud Nadim Pasha's cruel and stupid rule, he was exiled from one end of the empire to the other as part of Mahmud Nadim's shuffling programs to keep his political opponents out of Istanbul. And there is this really remarkable episode where the reformist Mithat Pasha desperately tries to get an audience with the Sultan Abdulaziz to directly register a complaint with the Sultan himself about Mahmud Nadim Pasha's corruption and his lack of aptitude for government. Now, this is a very, very risky move, because if Mahmud Nadim Pasha or if any of his numerous supplicants or allies are present during this meeting, they can poison the well against Mithat Pasha. They can counter-attack and just say, Mithat Pasha is lying, he is trying to usurp your rule. And actually, in those days, falling out of favor with the Sultan could end with an execution warrant. So he was gambling his life, basically. And right here, Ali Efendi's memoirs assume a tone like a spy thriller. So Mithat Pasha is in Istanbul for one night only, and he has a letter drafted directly to the Sultan saying, I am but a humble servant. I simply wish private time with you in order to voice my views better so that the empire is better governed. This is the way to talk to the Sultan. You have to have no negative attitudes in your words. You have to always be supplicant. You always have to say, I am but a humble servant. Of course, everybody knows what's what. I mean, Abdulaziz himself knows the power of these bureaucrats, so he is scared too, and he might be playing Mahmud Nadim and Mithat Pasha against each other so that he doesn't get into trouble. So it's like a goddamn Game of Thrones in there. So with extreme difficulty, Mithat Pasha acquires a direct late night audience with the Sultan, and by some reason Mahmud Nadim is not there. The corrupt Grand Vizier is not there. So he enters the palace and the audience chamber, but suddenly there's this old man with a gaunt and unsmiling face. And Mithat Pasha is terrified. He says, oh my God, is this one of Mahmud Nadim's stooges here to rat me out? But then, right there, he makes up his mind. He is resolute. He says, even if this man speaks against me and gets the Sultan to kill me, I will have to speak what I know is the truth. And so help me God. And he actually starts saying, your Grand Vizier Mahmud Nadim is thinking about himself and his own interests first. And the old man in the room gives a weird look at Mithat Pasha speaking to the Sultan. But Mithat Pasha goes on. He is selling out the empire to foreign empires and foreign companies. He is making money on the side for his own interests. He is truly a deplorable Grand Vizier. And the old man looks at him again, moves as if to say something, and suddenly starts speaking. And he says, this man, my Sultan, is correct. Mahmud Nadim is a genuinely evil ruler. He had me exiled to an unimportant post in the Erzurum province and so on and so forth. So actually, the old guy who Mithat Pasha was suspicious of wins the day for him. And the Sultan begins speaking, and he says, I know what you mean. For this reason, Mahmud Nadim shall no longer be my Grand Vizier. You, Mithat, shall be my Grand Vizier. What a surprising victory! Or maybe it was all planned beforehand, and what we saw was just the theatrics. In Ottoman politics, you never know. But at this junction, please consider, this is like some Game of Thrones or Dune kind of political will-to-power thriller right here. Forget the Ottoman setting. Imagine rewriting this thing in a sci-fi setting and you would have something like the Star Wars prequels, you know? It's a life and death struggle for power in a corrupt and decaying empire of multiple alien interests. What fascinating stuff. And so suddenly there's a flourishing of hope in the Ottoman capital. All of Mahmud Nadim Pasha's evil deeds are reversed, the unfair contracts are taken back from the German companies, and the Greek guy who unfairly got the tobacco monopoly loses it. A lot of previous allies of Mahmud Nadim are now themselves exiled to distant and unimportant jobs in places like Yemen and the wastes of Arabia or the East Caucasus or something like that, you know. And the empire is actually now better governed under Mithat Pasha. And even the freedom of press thrives somehow. And this is one of the most ridiculous events in the whole story. So 2 more Turkish newspapers open up, Devir and Bedir, these newspapers. But Ali Efendi says, oh, they just run for a few issues and they're closed once again. It's like, oh God, we're free, we are free, quick, newspapers, man. No, 4 days later, no, you're fucked. In fact, a curious episode happens here. During this episode, actually, the Basiret newspaper, Ali Efendi's newspaper itself gets closed for a few days. So another newspaper known as Tercüman-ı Hakikat can get better sales. Imagine how corrupt and like how lawless this place has become. Like even under Mithat Pasha's progressive rule, you know, they close this newspaper so an upstart can get more sales. But actually that upstart also gets cancelled in like 4 months or so. So it's back to Basiret with Basiretçi Ali Efendi. But my favorite thing were like these 2 newspapers just coming out of nowhere, Devir and Bedir. And they just get shut down in 4 years. It's like this makes me laugh in the same way those videos of stupid 1 brain cell cats falling off tables and stuff makes me laugh. It's just the darkest form of dark hilarity. And it's also very telling, huh? Some things never change. Some things, it seems, are universal. So all in all, you might expect, well, it's all good now. Mithat Pasha is a progressive Grand Vizier. He's a progressive Prime Minister. Everything will be marvelous in the Ottoman land and the gradual decline of the empire will be stopped. Except that, no, it doesn't. Actually, somehow Mahmud Nadim Pasha returns. Like one day, Abdulaziz, like a few months later, he just says, okay, I just want Mahmud Nadim Pasha back again. And all this progressive hope goes out of the window. But this time it's actually really, really bad. And to such a degree that when Mahmud Nadim goes to get his Grand Vizier's seal for the second time, now this was an elaborate ritual. Basically, the Grand Vizier would personally go to the Sultan's palace or send an envoy to the Sultan's palace to get the seal of the Grand Vizier. So now he has the power. But when this was happening in Mahmud Nadim's second term, there was actually an uprising by certain normal citizens of Istanbul, and they're saying, no, we can't have him again, down with Mahmud Nadim, down and out, and stuff like that. And actually the henchman charged with picking up the seal and taking it to Mahmud Nadim, because being a coward he did not go himself, and he was chased, it says in Ali Efendi's memoirs. He was chased and he actually left his shoes on the road, so that was that. But nevertheless, Mahmud Nadim has a second reign, and the corruption and increasing degeneracy of the empire goes on at full speed. at this point, Basiretçi Ali Efendi complains of an increasing Russian interference in Ottoman politics. He says that through Mahmud Nadim and his corrupt lackeys, the Russians had Abdulaziz's ear. And at this point you think maybe the other guy, Mithat Pasha, the quote-unquote progressive, was also working for another world power. But this goes unstated in Ali Efendi's memoir. I mean, clearly this guy also was probably under some sort of great power protection, because remember, he went to Germany and they gave him the latest technology, printing presses, just because they were so good, just out of the goodness of their hearts, okay? But now things take a really, really dark turn in the Ottoman Empire. There's an economic crisis, there are more rebellions in the Balkans, provinces risk breaking away into states of their own. There are some wars which really don't go well, and it's just a dark, dark time. To such a degree that a certain statesman named Hüseyin Avni Pasha, hatches a plan to depose not just Mahmud Nadim, but the Sultan himself. God damn. This is a very, very audacious task. Stuff like this did happen before in the Ottoman realms, but nothing like this. He's planning a coup, and he gathers a group of professional soldiers and progressive politicians around him. This new character, Hüseyin Avni Pasha, remember his name now, Hüseyin Avni Pasha, and they plan long and hard, for nights and nights. They plan, they gather, they make plans, and some people say, we have to act now, I have 100 soldiers, we can strike the palace now and just depose the Sultan. But actually, this guy, Hüseyin Avni, is a smart guy. He said, no, slowly, let us observe the situation for at least a year. But some of the hotheads say, and for a year, people keep dying and our empire keeps stagnating. And here Hüseyin Avni says, if we hasten now, we might inflict more damage than waiting for a year would do. So slowly. And so they work, under the currents, they work under the cover of darkness, they make political connections, they win new allies, but they never act. And they arrive to this following conclusion. Deposing a sultan is an enormous task. And for a great majority of Ottoman subjects, the Sultan is like a god on earth, basically. He is the caliph, after all. He is the last remaining representative of Islam itself. And Abdulaziz has this title. And Abdulaziz clearly was growing more senile, and he was devoting more of his time to foreign pursuits. He was going on to these trips abroad, and actually in certain cases he was bad-mouthing the subjects of his own empire. He would go to a visit to Europe and he would say things to the effect of like, when my people are civilized enough, we will have operas like you do. And in fact, Abdulaziz himself, a side note, was a classical composer. In fact, some of the music you keep hearing in the background of this incredible story was composed directly by Abdulaziz, the Sultan himself. And what an age, huh? Everybody associates Ottomans with these Oriental trappings, but there was far more to the Sultans and their life than first impressions or these stereotypical views suggest. But anyways, going back to the plan to depose Sultan Abdulaziz. So the plotters get in touch with Murat, a related, I think he is Abdulaziz's nephew or something. They get in touch with this prince called Murat V, and they get a tacit agreement saying that, if they can depose Abdulaziz, this guy will step up to be Sultan. But you can't really depose the Sultan without risking a huge religious right-wing rebellion, because this guy is also the caliph. In order to diffuse that threat, they need to make allies with another very important Ottoman government official called the Sheikhul Islam. Now, although the Sultan is the caliph, the Sheikhul Islam represents the entire Muslim theological seminary. He's a bit like, not like the Pope, but he is responsible for the veracity of faith, let us say. And he's a very, very vaunted court member. Now, Abdulaziz knows this, so he has a kind of supplicant and kind of like ineffectual Sheikhul Islam in place, a man called Hasan Fehmi, and the plotters under Hüseyin Avni Pasha get in touch with a another member of the clergy called Hayrullah Efendi, and this Hayrullah Efendi says, I will make a fatwa saying that the Ottoman Sultan was unfit to rule because he was getting insane, or he was not mentally up for the challenge. And I will sign this fatwa and I will make your coup have religious legitimacy. So that's how they agree. But there is actually an acting Shaykhul Islam, Hasan Fehmi, and Abdulaziz keeps a very close eye on this guy. He frequently gives him payments, like to keep him on his side. So how are you gonna do this? First, they need to get a new Shaykhul Islam elected so that the new Shaykhul Islam can at least approve the coup these guys are gonna pull off. It's 4D chess. It's like skating on frictionless ice with instant death in every corner. These guys are playing a tough game. So how do you do something like this? How do you depose an already standing Shaykhul Islam? I mean, it's not like this guy is democratically elected. He's put there by the Sultan, so it seems like it's a deadlock. But Hüseyin Avni Pasha is very crafty. Through his network of supporters, he begins paying off religious ministers. He begins paying off imams who demonstrate against the pre-existing Shaykhul Islam. And they think, the times are getting dark. We need a new leader. We need a new Shaykhul Islam. We need something more righteous to conduct the affairs of the god. So they basically indulge in an astroturfing campaign to kind of ferment the street against the pre-existing Shaykhul Islam. And it takes some pushing back, but in due time, Hayrullah Efendi is elected as the Shaykhul Islam. And then he approves and writes the fatwa calling Sultan Abdul Hamid incompetent to rule. And then in one night, Hüseyin Avni Pasha and his supporters pull the coup against Sultan Abdulaziz. And it's a narrow success. First, one of the plotters gets some soldiers from the army, and then another one of the plotters, he's a naval lord, and he sends actually Ottoman steamships. He positions the ships in front of the Sultan's palace on the Bosphorus. And for those of you who don't know, in Istanbul, the sea goes inside the city. The two halves of the city, the palaces and everything, they face the sea itself. So this admiral positions steamships in front of Abdulaziz's palace at night. And then under the cover of darkness, the palace is surrounded, and then the plotters, like 3 a.m. or something, wake up Sultan Abdulaziz. And he says, "What is this thing? How dare you wake me up in this hour?" And then the guy who's like in charge of talking to the Sultan just shows the window in the dead of the night. There against the windows is the Ottoman cruiser directing its guns against the palace, and he says, "My lord, until this moment you were the Sultan. Now the nation sees fit to dethrone you and enthrone Sultan Murad V. And by his orders, I am now taking you to another place where you will be interned. Now if you will kindly go." So thus ends the reign of Abdulaziz. An era ends in Ottoman history, and Abdulaziz, increasingly paranoid and despondent and depressed that he got deposed in a coup, commits suicide a while later, cutting his own wrists with nail scissors, like little clippers. And it must have been a terrible, terrible ordeal, but that's how this man passes, basically. This cultured, if vain Sultan who composed operas and tried in his best capacity to judge conflicting interests of great powers and competing governors and government officials, that's how he dies, and it's always a tragedy. So dark. And thus ends the reign of Sultan Abdulaziz. Behold the reign of Sultan Murad V, El-Muzaffar Daima. So people had high hopes of the Sultan and his government, but actually the new Sultan turns out to be an anxious neurotic. He's so unwell that it ends up affecting his health and he's not right in the mind, you know. So things don't go as planned. The people pulling his strings, Hüseyin Avni Pasha and his collaborators, seek for a replacement in his brother, a certain Abdul Hamid, who promises to be a team player, and he certainly won't, try to take things into his own hands or anything like that. So quietly, Murad V is forced to abdicate and a new era begins. Behold the reign of Sultan Abdulaziz II Han el-Muzaffer Daima. Well, contrary to everybody's hopes, if you know anything about Turkish history, the new Sultan, Abdulhamid II, turns out to be an extreme power player. A lot of things happen, but suffice it to say, he establishes a very competent but extremely autocratic regime that suppresses basically everything and anything for decades. Personally, I think this was a necessary evil, and Abdulhamid II was the last Ottoman Sultan willing or able to exercise his power to rule. I think put anybody in his shoes and they would have had to do similar things simply to stop the empire from dissolving and tearing itself apart. But yes, it did not go well for anybody who expected a fresh breath of air or a progressive change or, things getting better really. It's just one grim dark development after the other. In the meantime, there's lots of wars, rebellions, successions. The Ottoman Empire enters a lot of wars, loses most of them. New countries are formed out of the lands they lost. So I'm not dwelling too deep into those because I want to keep the theme centered on Ali Efendi and his Basiretçi newspaper. Now, under the rule of Abdulhamid II, Ali Efendi still goes on publishing his newspaper. Funnily enough, despite being an Islamist, Ali Efendi is very critical of Abdulhamid and he publishes his newspaper to the best of his ability. And so goes on life. But there's a strange event that marks the first phase of Abdulhamid's reign. So when everything is going on and Abdulhamid is just enthroned, slowly beginning to reach out his feelers and exercise and build up his power, Ali Efendi makes friends with a certain intellectual figure, a politician named Ali Suavi. And the two get along really well. Ali Suavi often entertains Ali Efendi in his great mansion, and sometimes he gives him little bits of text to publish. Little poems, little insights from history, certain innocent political commentaries, so on and so forth. But one day, Ali Suavi says, Ali Efendi, would you mind publishing this thing I wrote up for basically your newspaper? It would just make me really happy. And it's just short article basically saying the following: for the foreign policy of the empire and inside as well, I know we are having certain difficulties now, but it is not impossible to set these difficulties back harmoniously and beautifully. This Monday, on this newspaper, I will publish certain things which the entire Ottoman public and everybody in the government would be well recommended to take heed. And that's all. That's all that this new figure, Ali Suavi, publishes on Ali Efendi's Basiretçi newspaper, okay? Now, imagine what happens next Monday. Turns out this Ali Suavi is actually plotting another counter-coup designed to reinstate the previously abdicated Sultan Murad V back to power. But unlike the previous coup, which took Abdulaziz out of the throne, this guy is too hasty. And actually his coup fails spectacularly. It's a total clusterfuck. Ali Suavi and a bunch of other people gather some soldiers and Balkan vigilantes around them, and they try to rush Abdulhamid's palace to depose him. But as they were doing so, in a certain place called Beşiktaş, a certain police officer named Hasan Pasha, together with the 7 or 8 of his men, stops these coup plotters, and he personally kills 7 or 8 of them, and actually he kills Ali Suavi himself. And so the counter-coup is dead in the water before it can even have a chance to take hold, And this is a side note, but Hasan Pasha is then handsomely rewarded by Abdulhamid, the reigning sultan. In fact, to this day, a certain district of Beşiktaş in Istanbul is named Hasan Pasha after this burly police officer who was a good servant to the sultan, and he did not even know how to read, so he signed his documents with the numbers 7 and 8, and his name became 7-8 Hasan Pasha. And to this day, in Istanbul, there's a place called the 7-8 Hasan Pasha Bakery that does incredible desserts and pastries. I think I'm gonna go there and grab some after this podcast. And if you listen to me this far, please consider supporting me on Patreon so I can get some pastries from the 7-8 Hasan Pasha Bakery, named after Hasan Pasha, who almost inadvertently and accidentally stopped a coup attempt against Abdulhamid. And of course, Abdulhamid's vengeance is terrible. In almost overnight, everybody, even indirectly linked to this Ali Suavi character, is arrested, they are jailed. Actually, Abdulhamid's palace itself turns into a big jail complex with hundreds of people interned. And yes, Ali Efendi and the Basiretçi newspaper obviously don't escape this persecution. After all, he accidentally, quote unquote, accidentally published something like a warning letter, almost presaging this coup in his newspaper. Now, he says he didn't know, as I always say, read between the lines here, okay? So because he had links to the German government, and remember in the beginning of this podcast, Ali Efendi was a guest of the German Emperor in Berlin, and actually there he had won something like a German imperial medal or something. Like, he had German connections basically. So he is questioned, and he's not directly tortured, but he sees other people getting tortured. In one of the grislier scenes in the book, there's another person involved with this coup attempt, but unlike Ali Efendi, this guy was just on the ground, with a gun trying to rush the palace. And the torturers put out a sperm whale candle. Now, these are not your ordinary candles. They're like very long and thick candles, almost like the size of a sword, that used to be made out of sperm whale oil. And it would burn like brighter than normal candles. So Ali Efendi describes the torturers putting the candle through the guy's eyeball, like he's screaming, he's blinded, and the next day he dies. And Ali Efendi thinks, that's the end for me, but the end doesn't come actually. What happens is, for several months, Ali Efendi is kept in a jail around Abdulhamid's palace. Abdulhamid consolidates his power. He becomes the last strong-willed sultan of the Ottoman Empire. His reign is extremely autocratic, but maybe that's what it takes to rule in a place like this, to be honest. I mean, just look at all the fucked up shit we saw, newspapers opening up only to be shut down 4 days later, arbitrary censorship, there's no clear succession of power, so everybody's plotting against each other. If you don't strike first, they will strike you, so what you gonna do? So that's why I have a softer view of Abdulhamid than many people out there. I actually greatly admire and respect him, and I don't think anybody else would do things differently had they been in his shoes. But anyways, back to Ali Efendi and his life. So he's in this palace jail for months because he's a high-ranking suspect, They can't kill him outright, and believe me, they would have if they could. But so he's there with a group of people. One day they tell him and a few other more upstanding or like high society members of this plot, they say, come on over, you're going on a boat ride. And he's very scared. He's scared maybe they're gonna throw him overboard, like the ship would go out for a bit and they would drown everybody. But no, it actually turns out that the boat sails on to the Mediterranean, and it is announced that everybody, including Ali Efendi, will be exiled to places like Jerusalem or Egypt or Haifa, places where nothing ever happens. Just like boring, the most boring, calmest part of the empire. How things have changed. And actually, on the way back, Ali Efendi is gripped by a sudden wave of hope. And somebody on the boat says, "Brothers, tonight, as we are on this boat, don't be disheartened. Actually, today is a blessed night for all of us. Now let us be merry and let us smile. We are not dead yet, and it looks like we won't be killed. May God protect our Ottoman Empire, and may God stave off all the evils plaguing our great nation. Amen. Let us pray to the skies on this boat ride at night." And off they pray, and off the boat goes to Jerusalem, where Ali Efendi will be exiled for numerous years. The Basiretçi newspaper will be closed. He will return after Abdulhamid II is deposed, but 30 years later, he will return. He will try to publish the Basiretçi newspaper again, but he's old now and it doesn't go anywhere. And thus ends Ali Efendi's life, spent for 50 years, half a century, in these intersecting worlds of coups, counter-coups, political subterfuge, and plotting, and just an overall waste of human potential. Now, people always ask me, why don't you do your stuff in Turkish? Why don't you create more content in Turkish? Well, I guess maybe this big story can give you certain hints of answers. Because suffice it to say that things are not too different. And not just politically. I mean, if you're in business life, work life, heck, even in personal relationships or among friends, it's a dog-eat-dog world out there. And the entire world has problems like this. But this part of the world, whatever you do, you get involved with this power game, whether you want it or not. If you don't want it, the power game involves itself with you. So personally, I've always taken good lessons from reading Ottoman biographies like this, and I've always kept my head down. I've become an exporter of information and, an exporter of stories, and I think it was better for everybody concerned. And on another side note, look how many lessons Ali Efendi's story and the story of the final Ottoman years can tell to the Western world, especially to the United States of America. There is government corruption, there are incompetent rulers, senile, mentally challenged, tottering at the edge of mental collapse, sound familiar? Sound familiar? Media is just a tool for power, and there is a disgusting confluence of powers behind the scenes and among private companies and among foreign interests. I think if you read what happened in the last century of the Ottoman Empire and apply it to the present day in the United States, you're 100 years ahead of everybody. I think the whole world is going to look like the Ottoman Empire in the next century. It's just going to be corruption, hopes, corruption again, hopes, but no, actually the bad guy comes back. It's gonna be a slow burn to apocalypse. I don't know, guys. I don't know. I hope you enjoyed this story, and also look at things this way. History is really cool if you know how to tell about it. History is really cool if you look at it through the lens of a single individual and his tribulations in a gigantic, unstable, shifting world, And if you want to, let's say you're trying to write some science fiction or fantasy stories, an easy and surefire way to do this is just to take something like this, change details to other planets, or maybe make the Ottoman Empire into the United States and the great powers, Russia, Germany, France, whatever, into aliens or something. Change things around but keep the story the same, and you will have an epic in no time. It will be something like Dune or the Star Wars prequels, and maybe that's what those things always have been, Well, that was that, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the story of Ali Efendi and the Basiretçi newspaper. What do you think about it? What were your favorite notes? What were the things that scared you the most? Just let me know in the comments, and At least by commenting, you can do something against the algorithm. As always, this has been CM Kozeman. Have a nice day, and I love you all.